The golden age of America begins right now. From this day forward, our country will flourish and be respected again all over the world.
President Trump ushering in what he calls the golden age of America, proclaiming America's decline is over. Trump flooding the zone with unprecedented executive orders from the southern border to renaming the Gulf of Mexico. Also pardoning 1,500 January 6 rioters. A lot to get to, needless to say. J.D. Durkin here. He is the host of Common Threads. J.D., good to see you. Let's try to get through as much as we can here. We need a couple of hours. What do you think the president is referring to when he says America's decline is over, the golden age is here? What do the numbers say currently about the shape of the U.S. economy now?
Well, on the macro sense here, Dave, I mean, the economy has been incredibly strong. You see that relative to where the market is priced in, forward-looking PE multiples. You talk about GDP healthy between 2 and 3%. We see still near the historic low for unemployment. And for the most part, yeah, we get some rare exceptions, but we get those job numbers the first Friday of every month, and we knock the cover off the ball. That can be true. At the same time, that it's true that the average American still feels the squeeze of high prices when they're at the grocery store or when they're filling up the gas tank. And I think that is what Donald Trump very successfully in leading Republicans, in part, large in part at least, campaigned on. And I was stunned, really, to have that inaugural address yesterday. And Donald Trump was really going at it, kind of criticizing his predecessor, Joe Biden, who, of course, was seated just a few feet away. Trump referred to this as a revolution of common sense. He called this the Liberation Day. And so it's a really fascinating kind of split screen. And then, of course, as the day went on, Dave, we can't forget, Trump gave a few addresses. And as we got later on into the night, they were much more off the cuff, much more rally style, where we heard a lot of reiterations of that same message that delivered him all 7 of the key swing states and ultimately the presidency.
Yeah, you started divisive and actually got more divisive as the day went through. So America's decline of a strong economy, strongest it's ever been relative to its peers, is over. That is an interesting prediction. So let's talk about 2 of the things that you just mentioned that ushered him into the White House. Bringing prices down. He said again he's going to do that yesterday. How does he do it, and how will tariffs impact that goal?
Much like you, Dave, had a lot of interviews with various economists or market technicians. Not entirely clear how you go about bringing prices down. And if you take the Federal Reserve on their face, if you listen to what Jay Powell says, it's not so much that you want to bring prices down because deflation would be bad for the U.S. economy, but instead you want to see a strengthening of real wages across the board so that the $4 you spend for apples or eggs don't feel like $4 you spend for apples and eggs, right? We kind of get used to higher prices because we're all getting more money in the form of take-home pay. I think that's clear for the Republican goals on budget reconciliation and tax cuts. The tariffs, however, are a different story. President Trump now frames tariffs as being an ultimate negotiating tool. He does not view them or frame them as a tax on the American consumer. That's not how most economists tend to view that. And so, we were expecting more tariff action, perhaps on day one, against countries like China, Canada, and Mexico. Perhaps we're getting a little bit of a relief rally this morning across the major market indexes, Dave, because it seems to be maybe a softer tone on tariffs than had been previously anticipated, at least for countries like Canada and Mexico. Seems like we're now eyeing something closer to February 1st as opposed to January 20th. So a little bit of wiggle room there maybe for negotiations in the coming weeks.
Yeah, every single economist I've had on here has suggested they will bring prices up if those 25% tariffs are put in place. The other one you mentioned was, and he mentioned yesterday, drill, baby, drill. Can't quite figure that one out because domestic energy production is at an all-time high and has been for 4 years under the Biden administration. We, in fact, lead the world in energy production, and we are a net exporter. Why would you want to drill under those circumstances?
It's a great point, Dave. I have frequently said if there is a drill, baby, drill president, it was actually Joe Biden. But the irony was that I think during the campaign, that was a politically inconvenient reality for both campaigns. It did not serve Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and the Democrats to admit that they drilled and have the energy production that they do, because they didn't really want to tick off the more progressive climate focused portion of their base. And it also was politically inconvenient for Donald Trump and the Republicans, because this was the message that they were running for. But Dave, you know as well as I do, perception drives the reality. If you were to ask the average American anywhere across the 50 states who is better for energy production, that voter would probably tell you it's Donald Trump and the Republicans. So one of the many executive orders that we saw yesterday, we're going to learn a lot more about in the coming days, without a doubt, is the removal of the United States from the Paris Climate Accord, trying to put these priorities front and center. And in doing so, mind you, we join a very small list of countries that are not a part of that agreement, along with Iran, Libya, and Yemen. Believe it or not, even North Korea has an existing pledge to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. So the U.S. is putting itself into a very small category here, but it shouldn't really come as a surprise to anyone who paid attention to Donald Trump on the campaign trail.
Messaging matters. Interesting to get out of the Paris Climate Agreement as both of our coasts see increasing global damage related to the climate. So let's talk about a host of executive orders. The one getting the most controversy this morning is ending birthright citizenship. Does any president have the legal authority to do so?
Well, this is really the Super Bowl for lawyers down in Washington, D.C., Dave, because they are really busy. We've already seen lawsuits filed against the Trump administration from groups like the ACLU, both at the federal and the state level. We're going to continue to see exactly where the lines are of presidential power. Donald Trump will argue, his White House, the presidency will argue, as the chief executive of the executive branch, we get far sweeping powers, more so than courts maybe previously have interpreted. And that's where it really becomes important to understand the degree to which the Republican Party has reshaped the judiciary across the country, not just the Supreme Court, but at lower court levels as well. And that's largely because, I would argue, of Republicans like Mitch McConnell. So when those things get tested, you're kind of punting them into the hands of conservatives who I think would more likely be inclined to agree with Donald Trump. But, other immigration as well. He declared a national emergency yesterday at the southern border. He could probably tap into unspent federal funds. Remember, during the first Trump presidency, we had this big conversation about deploying the National Guard or other units of the U.S. military to better fortify the U.S. border. Yesterday, President Trump cutting down on humanitarian parole for migrants who come from 4 key countries: Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. So that, again, was really front and center for the Trump messaging on the campaign trail. And lawyers are going to be very busy trying to figure out what he can actually do and what he can't do in the days and weeks ahead.
It is written fundamentally into our Constitution. He would need a constitutional amendment to do so. Of course, the image that everyone was focused on was all the big tech CEOs there, front and center. Apple's Tim Cook, Meta's Mark Zuckerberg, Amazon's Jeff Bezos, Google's Sundar Pichai, of course, the TikTok CEO, who we'll get to in a moment. What do you make of their presence, where they were seated, and ultimately, what are they hoping for in return for their parade of million-dollar checks?
What was amazing was, because we moved the inauguration indoors yesterday, Dave, we kind of had that luncheon inside what's called Statuary Hall. It's the old hall of the House of Representatives yesterday. And it gave us I know, man, we've used the word unprecedented so many times the last 10 years, but it really did give us that exact type of very anomalous view into watching regulators openly mixed with big tech CEOs, openly mixed with Supreme Court justices and cabinet official picks. And so on the one hand, I get there's a lot of frustration, people saying that's kind of gross behavior from these CEOs, a Bezos, a Zuckerberg, a Pichai, et cetera. But on the other hand, look, if you're a shareholder in one of these companies, Tim Cook, I think, set the mold, set the model the first Trump presidency. How do you cozy up to this guy in a way where your own interests as a business leader are able to be taken care of? Apple avoided the worst of the tit-for-tat tariff disputes between Washington and Beijing, during the first Trump presidency. And I think other business CEOs took a page out of Tim Cook's book for that. And so it was, a really interesting display. And I'm sure there'll be a lot more lobbying and trips to Washington for all those business leaders and their lobbyists in the months ahead.
The broligarchs is one of the great terms I've heard come out of the last few days. What will be interesting is what happens when these CEOs and their companies all issued public remarks in the wake of January 6th, starkly opposing that. What happens when there are mass deportations, tens of millions of Americans? What happens to trillion-dollar companies? Did they remain silent in the face of some of those things? That's going to be interesting. Let's talk TikTok real quick. It's been a whirlwind couple of days. Just where do you think this ends and how?
Taking President Trump at his face yesterday, he is now seemingly arguing that the U.S. should somehow own half of it. Not entirely clear how that would work. I listened to a few interviews this morning from people like former Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, who, in his capacity as a private citizen since, is kind of part of this Kevin O'Leary type of crowd who might want to try and get the money necessary to buy the U.S. components about this. But, this was clearly a stunt from TikTok to go dark on Saturday night and then kind of give this effusive praise to Donald Trump and say, oh, we're so thankful for President Trump for doing this, even if he's the person who tried to shut us down in the first place. Donald Trump really got the ball moving in the idea of planting the seeds of kind of banning TikTok to begin with. So honestly, I don't mean to punt on the question. I have no idea how this is going to go. Donald Trump, I think, is now eyeing a 75-day extension or so. But, he now recognizes the value. I think it was those few TikToks that were made for him. He saw the explosive growth, the millions of views on it during this last campaign trail cycle. And we know he's got a lot of high-end donors, people like Jeff Yass of Susquehanna, who directly have a stake in the success of ByteDance as well. So a lot of things going on behind the scenes to, I think, help explain President Trump's personal 180 on the TikTok situation. For now, it's here. I don't expect it ultimately to go anywhere. But as a matter of how we get there is going to be a very confusing path, I think.
It was one of the most well-choreographed dances we've seen in TikTok history. We've seen a lot on that platform. It appears he'll, please keep doing that, just the rest of the segment, that they will try to force the Attorney General to let it live. But ultimately, it comes down to Apple and to Oracle and those companies if they want to continue to host it.